First, I would like to start by thanking the Academy for this honor to present to the Academy some of the work that we do at the Raman Research Institute. Um, so I am an experimental atomic physicist, and we basically, the essence of our work at the Raman Institute in my lab is to understand the interaction between quantum particles. And for that, we build a variety of experiments and we try and figure out what's going on between when particles interact. So what are the motivations behind studying interactions? So essentially what we want to do is precisely measure the interaction between two quantum systems, which we know very well, and we want to then use that to understand what are the consequences of these interactions. Now, you might ask, but isn't this all known? And the thing is, what I would reply is not really. And the reason behind this is the most of the time when we are looking at even very well studied quantum systems, when we want to study the interactions or we want to study consequences of interactions, we mask the real interaction with simplifying approximations to account for the effects that we are observing. But that is not necessarily the full tale of what the interaction actually is. And when we are talking about in recent times, we are talking about engineering precise quantum systems. There's a lot of buzz about quantum information processing, computers, etc. And in such systems, when we are talking about interactions, we really need to understand what the interactions actually mean. And this is what the essence of our work is. And this is what we do. At RRA, we use all the tools to understand interacting quantum systems. So what are the quantum systems that we want to look at? So we want to look in the gaseous phase at atoms, molecules, and their ions. Okay, so why is this the system of choice? So the most important, there are some very important things which makes these very ideal and therefore very useful to doing to measuring interactions for quantum systems. First of all, individually as isolated systems, these are very well understood. Okay, and they are abundantly available. Every molecule of oxygen behaves exactly like every other molecule of oxygen, so they're all identical, and that is why you don't have to classify each one of them separately. You measure it all once and then you know what is the quantity you're dealing with. So there's no system preparation which is required. But that means that the reservoirs of these quantum systems are readily existing. But there are more requirements that come up. One is that in order to work with this, as I said, we are interested in gaseous ensembles. So we have to localize this system. So this atom has to be put in one place so that you can experiment with it. So this is what we call trapping. Then you have to prepare the state of the system. I mean, you can get a bunch of atoms from a reservoir, but they may not necessarily all be in the exact same state. And you would have to then put in work in order to put them in the same state. So you need control over the state of the system. And the last thing that you require is that if you want to study the interactions, then you want to start by freezing the kinetic energy of the system of interest. Now, why is this very important? The thing is that if you look at the kinetic theory of gases, the regular textbook description of gases is very adequate over large ranges of conditions. Why? In that theory, you mimic the interaction between particles as collisions, and those collisions are hard sphere. No problem. Everything works. And what is the reason this works is because the kinetic energy of the gaseous molecules is actually dominating the potentials. It's sliding on top of the potentials and it is dominating the potentials. But when we want to go into quantum theory, and we want to measure interactions between quantum systems, we want to strip away the kinetic part and look at the potentials. So this is, and this, for this, we have to cool the system. That is, okay, so let me tell you what these things are. So trapping is the act of containing objects in a certain spatial volume and below a certain kinetic energy. Okay, so this is an example of an ion trap, for instance. So you can see there are electrodes, and on these electrodes are put oscillating field, and due to the presence of oscillating field, if you have a charged particle in it, by virtue of the field configuration, which is like a saddle which rotates, you will trap an ion in time. And what it looks like is the following, that so if you look at the trajectory of the ion, it will look like, so this is a coordinate as a function of time. This is the velocity of this coordinate in that coordinate as a function of time. And this is the kind of phase diagram that results of a trapped ion in such a situation. State preparation. So now you have an atom. Ideally, when you want it, you want two levels, and you want to measure some small shifts in these two levels in order to tell you what is going on with this. However, we do not, the closest we come to two levels is something like this. This, I'm showing you an energy level diagram for rubidium. And you can see that each of these two levels, which is actually, this is a fine structure split. There is a further split into hyperfine structures. And each of these has a magnetic substate. So there are all these states which are there. And when you want to do such experiments, you want to drop the entire population that you're working with into one of these states. You can pick whichever one depending on the science you want to do. So that is another thing that we need to do. The third thing is cooling, which is when you want to reduce the kinetic energy of the ensemble that you want to prepare for your interaction experiments. And cooling is basically something which happens through a process of scattering. Multiple scattering is what dominates cooling. Whether you do that multiple scattering with light, that is like laser cooling or whatever, or you do it in collision with matter, which is like atoms and so on and so forth. There's another way you can do this, is that if you can connect it to a bath, which you can do by resistive dissipation, but that is not what we are talking about in this particular thing. This is how a magneto-optical trap works. It's a combination of laser cooling in a gradient magnetic field produced by the current in these two coils. And what you then get is a cloud of atoms hung in space, which is essentially, which is out there for you to experiment with. The glowing is the cooling, and the fact that it is held together right there is magnetically levitated is the trapping. Okay, so this is how it's working, and what you are doing is, so what we want to do when we want to prepare these systems, okay, we need to simultaneously cool, trap, and state manipulate these systems. Because what happens is, if you are not cooling, the energy, you have trapped particles, but you're not cooling them, then the things couple to the environment and they heat, and the particle energy increases. So without cooling, energy of the trapped particles increases. Without trapping, the particles do not stay long enough to be cooled properly. And both of these things require state preparation. So what happens is that there's a requirement to trap. And when you put all these things together, even if you want to trap a single species of atoms or ions or molecules or whatever, you would have to do all these things for that particular species. So now, what are we doing at the Raman Institute? So I've already told you that atoms, ions, and molecules are what we are interested in. And each of them has different mechanisms for trapping. And cooling, there are similarities in the mechanism, because I said that cooling is about scattering, but how you do the scattering is not necessarily extremely, very easy to engineer when you're doing this. And in order to do this, we developed at the Raman Institute new experiments, a new class of experiments, which we which is now called hybrid traps, which essentially can trap an ion and an atom together so that we can study the interactions between ions and atoms, or atoms and molecules, or atoms and molecules and light, and so on and so forth. So this is the strategy where you can connect all these very well individually studied quantum systems into a scenario where you can study interactions. So what does such an experiment look like? This is one example of our experiments. And what you find is that, okay, so here is the main heart of the experiment. And you see, this is a vacuum chamber. The gray part is the vacuum chamber. What I have here is two mirrors. This is arranged so that they are facing exactly at each other, and therefore what each mirror sees is being reflected, much like the barber shop. And so if an atom is here, it sees its reflections multiply reflected, and this contributes to how much an atom interacts with the field. You can tune this particular atom with the light which is resonant with this cavity with the atoms by changing the length of the cavity. Then you have the magneto-optical trap, which I had introduced earlier, and the beams which you use for it. I've not shown you the coils for the gradient magnetic field. You have some detections, and then you have the heart of the trap, where you have various electrodes which you can operate on. You put a combination of DC and radio frequency fields in order to trap ions with these guys, with these electrodes. And so therefore, where you can trap atoms. So what happens in this situation? You trap atoms, you trap ions in this cavity, and the molecules can be made out of the atoms, or the atoms and the ions, or whatever you want. Okay, so this is how we make the atom ion molecule light hybrid trap. So now this is what the whole construction of such an experiment looks like. This is the hardware. If you come to the lab, and since the academy is hosted on the RRI grounds, is contiguous, I would say. You are more than welcome to see it when you come over, but you will see not this, but you will see it enveloped in scaffolding and a whole bunch of optics. And this is a cloud of lithium atoms which is being photographed. Okay, so now what did it do when we set up doing this ion trap? So these ion atom experiments. So I will now tell you one part of some of the work that we did. So recall that cooling is affected by scattering. Now, in one of the foundational papers of ion trapping is by Major and Demelt in 1968, and they gave a theory of collision of ions, of cooling of ions in collision with the atoms. And what they found was the following. Ions will cool in collision with atoms if the ion is heavier than the mass of the atoms. Remember that an ion cannot be trapped in a DC electric trap. It needs to have the radio frequency component, otherwise the Ehrenfest theorem is not will lead it to move out. Consequently, lighter mass ions will get heated up when it collides with a heavier atoms when the lighter mass ion is trapped. So this is all because the ion is dynamically trapped. In our experiments with trapped atoms, and this has been validated for 50 odd years, okay, this is the dogma. This is one of the pillars on which the field has been evolved. So in our experiments with trapped ions and atoms in our hybrid traps, we see that this thing is apparently violated. and we see cooling whether or not the atom is heavier or lighter than the ion or equal in mass. And that was it caused quite a buzz. And the fact is that what we also find is that the temperature the ion will cool to is determined by the position and the spatial size of the reservoir rather than the difference in the kinetic energy. So here's a very important thing. Because the ions are dynamically trapped, the size of the reservoir which is cooling it is much more important at the energy scales that we are working on than the actual temperature of the reservoir. I mean, obviously the reservoir of atoms is cooler than the ions, but it's the size which will determine the steady state temperature that the ions cool to, and um, not the temperature. And so what does that so what does the experimental result look like? And I've just put one slide of graphs, and that's it. So here is a situation where there is the mass of the atom is larger than the mass of the ion. In the case of Demelt and Major, this should heat the ion, but we are showing cooling because the red points decay slower than the gray points, and that this is a logarithmic scale. Okay. When the mass of the ion is greater than the mass of the atoms, we again see the same behavior. And when the masses are equal of the atoms and the reservoir ions, then we see a extremely enhanced cooling, because this slope is much less than these slopes. And that is essentially shows that there's something going on here. And so let's say what's going on. So this is the result which I was telling you about of Major and Demelt from the late 60s, where there's, depending on what the mass ratios are, you see heating, cooling, or no change in the kinetic energy of the ions. However, here is what happens. So this was the experimental paradigm that they worked with. They had an ion trap in which the ions would oscillate, immersed in a chamber of gas, immersed in a chamber of gas, and that chamber, when the ions collided, this would result, and this has been verified numerous times. So why did things change when we started our experiments? And in our experiments, we show in each case there is cooling. And the reason is that when we built the hybrid trap, we essentially localize the atoms at the very center of the ion trap. So essentially what is happening is that we are in the flat domain of the ion trap. Now in this situation, think of it like, so we are no longer subject to the really critical issues that you face when you are dynamically trapped in an oscillatory potential. We are in flat space, and therefore when one heavy and one light, or two equal mass, or whatever collision, so whatever the mass ratio of the particles is, if one of them is stopped and the other one is moving, irrespective of the mass ratios, then the energy will transfer to the other colliding partner, and therefore you see cooling across the board. And that was one of the very important messages that we took to the community. Now, there's another thing which matters, which is that when the masses were equal, and that masses are equal because it's the same ion which is colliding with the atom, a resonant channel emerges. And what that resonant channel is the following. For cooling, let's say you have, this is the position and this is the bottom of the ion and the atom trap, which are coincident, and there is an atom which is zero velocity, so it's moving this way in time. It's not moving, basically it's stationary. A fast ion is coming, and when they are proximate in a glancing scenario, in a glancing collision scenario, the electron that the atom possesses gets shared between these two, and when they separate, with 50% chance, a fast atom can go and a very cold ion can stay at the bottom of the ion trap. So this is an extremely effective resonant process that we discovered, and we have both the theory and the experiment for all of these things that I have told you. And so these are two of the things that I would like to say about this thing. And this resonant charge exchange, while the cross section is lower, it is far, far, far more effective at transferring energy out of the ion. So what next? And what next is that you want to do an experiment which exploits this particular exchange by competing ballistic scattering based transport with charge hopping based transport at ultra cold temperature, and that is the new experiment that we built. This is that experiment which is already ongoing in our lab, and I hope to talk to you soon about these things. Meanwhile, these are the people who are there, and that is what I would like to communicate today. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sadiq, for that. We have one question for you and a comment from G. Bhaskaran, who says, a very nice talk, Sadiq, and then he asks, is it conceivable that ion and neutral atom subsystems equilibrate to different temperatures via a dynamic decoupling?
So, okay. So what we have seen is that the ions go into a different steady state energy distribution as compared to the atoms. Atoms can be cooled with much more ease to much lower temperature than ions, and ions you have to put in a lot of work. Now, I'm not so sure what you mean by dynamic decoupling. Okay, but the point is the following, that because the potential for the ion is the ion is dynamically trapped, it reacts to, it has a position dependent kinetic energy that is in the very nature of the trapping. You have the position dependent kinetic energy that expresses itself, and because of this it becomes very hard to, as soon as you displace from the nodal point where the field, that is the oscillatory field, is exactly zero, you start getting into you start pumping in energy into the ion, and the most effective way to pump energy into the ion is, once it is displaced, and we have a paper on this also, is in the collision with the atom, the ion actually picks up a lot of energy. So what the some of the conclusions that I have drawn here, they are model dependent. It depends on how much detail you want to put in the interaction in order to express the, to understand what is going on. So, and this is also the reason why we need to do such studies.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Sadiq, for a very interesting talk.